August 9, 1945. The city of Nagasaki shuddered beneath a light that had no earthly precedent, a brilliance that erased shadows and rendered the sun itself pale by comparison. At 11:02 in the morning, the plutonium core of a weapon called Fat Man achieved critical mass 1,850 feet above the Urakami Valley. And for an instant, briefer than a heartbeat, a fragment of stellar fire burned at the heart of a Japanese city. The temperature at ground zero exceeded 1 million degrees Celsius. Stone melted, steel vaporized, human beings ceased to exist in any form recognizable as having once been alive. The blast wave that followed traveled faster than sound, collapsing buildings 3 miles from the epicenter, shattering windows 9 miles away. A mushroom cloud rose 60,000 feet into the stratosphere, visible from neighboring islands, a pillar of smoke and radioactive debris that announced to anyone watching that humanity had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. In Tokyo, 650 miles to the northeast, members of the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War, the inner cabinet that held Japan's fate in their hands, received reports of the explosion, with a numbness born of catastrophe piled upon catastrophe. 3 days earlier, another such weapon had obliterated Hiroshima. Before that, 334 B-29 superfortresses had incinerated Tokyo in a single night of firebombing. Before that, 200 cities had been marked for destruction, subjected to raids that turned urban centers into crematoriums, that left millions homeless and industry paralyzed. Now this, a second atomic bomb, proof that the Americans possessed not one miracle weapon, but many, that they could deliver apocalypse at will, that nowhere in Japan was safe and no defense was possible. In the lacquered halls of the Imperial Palace, in the underground conference rooms where military leaders debated terms and conditions and honor, the sound that dominated was not voices raised in argument, but the profound, terrible silence of men confronting the unthinkable. Japan, undefeated in living memory, the empire that had conquered half of Asia, the nation whose warrior culture had sustained 4 years of total war, was beaten, not merely defeated in battle or outmaneuvered strategically, but rendered powerless to resist. Its cities turned to ash, its military machine dismantled, its population exposed to weapons against which courage and sacrifice offered no defense. The question was no longer whether to surrender, but how to surrender while preserving some fragment of the world that had been. To understand the magnitude of this moment required understanding how far Japan had fallen, how absolute the reversal had been between the triumph of December 1941 and the abyss of August 1945. When Japanese carrier aircraft struck Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Japan was a nation that had known only victory. For 50 years, since the Meiji Restoration had transformed a feudal society into an industrial power, Japan had measured its progress in military success. It had defeated China in 1895, shocked the world by destroying the Russian fleet in 1905, seized German colonies in the Pacific during World War I, and embarked on the conquest of China in 1937. The Japanese military, particularly the Imperial Japanese Navy, saw itself as the equal of any Western power and the superior of most. The attack on Pearl Harbor, whatever its strategic limitations, seemed to confirm this assessment. In a single morning, Japanese aircraft had crippled the American Pacific Fleet, sinking or damaging 8 battleships, destroying 188 aircraft, killing 2,403 Americans. Simultaneously, Japanese forces swept across Southeast Asia with a speed and coordination that stunned Western observers. Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day, 1941. Manila fell on January 2, 1942. Singapore, 119 feet, Sekatid, the supposedly impregnable fortress city that guarded the approaches to British India, surrendered on February 15th after a campaign that Churchill would call the worst disaster in British military history. The Dutch East Indies, Burma, The Philippines. All fell within 6 months. By mid-1942, Japan controlled an empire stretching from the Aleutian Islands to the borders of India, encompassing 1/7 of the Earth's land surface and more than 450 million people. The architects of this expansion, the admirals and generals who planned Japan's strategy, operated under assumptions that seemed reasonable given the nation's history and understanding of warfare. They believed that Western powers, particularly the United States, lacked the will for a prolonged conflict in the distant Pacific. They anticipated that after a series of sharp defeats, America would negotiate a settlement that recognized Japan's sphere of influence in Asia. They counted on the defensive advantages of holding thousands of fortified islands across the Pacific, any one of which could be reinforced and defended at far less cost than it could be attacked. Most critically, they believed in the spiritual superiority of the Japanese warrior, the power of Bushido to overcome material disadvantage, the willingness of Japanese soldiers and civilians to endure sacrifices that Western democracies would find intolerable. These assumptions were not merely military calculations, but articles of cultural faith, embedded in decades of propaganda that portrayed Japan as uniquely suited for empire, destined by history and geography to lead Asia. The early victories seemed to confirm everything. When Japanese pilots at Pearl Harbor saw American battleships burning and capsizing, when Japanese soldiers witnessed British troops surrendering at Singapore, when the Imperial Navy ranged across the Pacific, seemingly at will, it appeared that history had vindicated Japan's vision of itself. The West was decadent, soft, unwilling to pay the price that Japan would gladly pay for victory. But America had not sued for peace. Instead, it had mobilized with a totality and efficiency that Japanese planners had not thought possible in a democracy, had never seen in their own experience with Western powers. The statistics of American industrial mobilization between 1942 and 1945 read like fantasy, numbers so vast they lost meaning until translated into concrete results. American shipyards launched 141 aircraft carriers of all types during the war, one every 11 days on average. They produced 310,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 2.4 million trucks, 41 billion rounds of ammunition. The economy expanded by over 50%, despite sending 16 million men and women into uniform. Women who had never worked in factories became welders and riveters. Automobile plants converted to tank production. The Manhattan Project, developing atomic weapons, employed 130,000 people and cost $2 billion without most participants knowing what they were building. This was not merely industrial capacity, but industrial capacity married to scientific expertise, organizational efficiency, and strategic vision. America approached the Pacific War not as a test of warrior spirit, but as a problem admitting of systematic solution. Destroy Japanese naval power, sever the empire's supply lines, capture bases progressively closer to the home islands, and bring overwhelming force to bear until resistance became physically impossible. The execution of this strategy proceeded with mechanical inevitability, each step building on the last, each victory opening the path to the next. At Midway in June 1942, American carrier aircraft sank 4 Japanese fleet carriers in a single day, destroying the core of Japan's offensive naval power and establishing a rough parity in the Pacific that would never again favor Japan. Guadalcanal, a 6-month campaign of attrition in the Solomon Islands, bled Japanese forces white in a battle for a remote airfield that spiraled into a test of wills Japan could not afford. The Central Pacific Offensive, island hopping from Tarawa to the Marianas, brought American bombers within range of the Japanese home islands by mid-1944. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the last major carrier engagement of the war, American pilots destroyed more than 600 Japanese aircraft in 2 days while losing fewer than 130 AE-5. Slaughter so one-sided that American aviators called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The liberation of the Philippines cost Japan the remnants of its combined fleet. Sunk piecemeal at Leyte Gulf in October 1944 in the largest naval battle in history. By early 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Its carriers had no aircraft. Its battleships had no fuel. Its sailors had been transferred to infantry units to defend the home islands from invasion that everyone knew was coming. The sound that accompanied Japan's descent into defeat was not the thunder of naval guns or the roar of aircraft engines, but something quieter and more pervasive. The drone of B-29 Superfortress bombers crossing Japanese skies at altitudes where interceptors struggled to reach them, in numbers that overwhelmed whatever defenses remained. The B-29 was itself a symbol of American industrial and technological superiority, an aircraft so advanced that it incorporated pressurized crew compartments, remote-controlled gun turrets, and a range of 3,250 miles. It was the most expensive weapons program of the war after the atomic bomb, costing more than $3 billion to develop and produce. But it delivered results commensurate with its cost. Operating from bases in the Marianas beginning in late 1944, B-29s could reach any city in Japan. Initially, they attempted high-altitude precision bombing with limited success. Then, in March 1945, the command switched tactics to low-altitude night incendiary raids targeting urban areas. The results were apocalyptic. On the night of March 9–10, 1945, 334 B-29s dropped 1,665 tons of incendiaries on Tokyo. The resulting firestorm killed an estimated 100,000 people in a single night, destroyed 16 square miles of the city, and left more than 1 million homeless. The heat was so intense that water in canals boiled. People suffocated in underground shelters when the firestorm consumed all available oxygen. Civilians fleeing through the streets were overtaken by walls of flame that traveled faster than humans could run. Those who reached the Sumida River threw themselves into water to escape the heat, only to be boiled alive or crushed by others seeking the same refuge. Over the following months, the pattern repeated with horrifying regularity. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama. Every major city and most minor ones were subjected to raids that turned Japanese urban centers into charnel houses. By August 1945, American aircraft had dropped 157,000 tons of bombs on Japan, two-thirds of it incendiaries designed to exploit the vulnerability of Japanese construction, which relied heavily on wood and paper. Approximately 40% of the built-up area of 66 cities had been destroyed. An estimated 333,000 civilians had been killed by conventional bombing, nearly 500,000 more injured, and 8.5 million made homeless. Industrial production had collapsed. The transportation network was paralyzed. Food supplies were so disrupted that urban populations faced starvation. The Japanese government, in internal assessments never shared with the public, estimated that the nation had perhaps 6 months of sustained resistance left before economic and social collapse became inevitable. Yet even confronting this reality, the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War remained divided on terms of surrender. The militarists, led by War Minister Korachika Anami and the chiefs of the Army and Navy General Staffs, insisted on conditions: preservation of the imperial system, no occupation of the home islands, Japanese control of war crimes trials, and Japanese supervision of disarmament. They argued that Japan could inflict such casualties in the defense of the home islands that America would negotiate rather than pay the blood price of invasion. They pointed to Iwo Jima, where 21,000 Japanese defenders had fought for 36 days and inflicted 26,000 American casualties. They pointed to Okinawa, where an 82-day campaign cost 50,000 American casualties and killed 100,000 Japanese soldiers and up to 150,000 Okinawan civilians. They believed, or claimed to believe, that the Japanese people would fight with such fanatical determination that Operation Downfall, the planned American invasion of Japan, would become a nightmare of urban warfare and civilian resistance that would force negotiations. Then came Hiroshima, August 6, 1945, at 8:15 in the morning. The B-29 Enola Gay released a uranium-based atomic bomb that detonated 1,900 feet above the city center. The blast wave, thermal pulse, and radiation killed an estimated 70,000 to 80,000 people immediately. By the end of the year, the death toll would exceed 140,000 as radiation sickness and injuries claimed more victims. The explosion obliterated everything within a 1-mile radius, reduced to rubble buildings 3 miles from ground zero, and caused third-degree burns to exposed skin 9 miles away. Survivors described a light brighter than the sun, a heat that turned human flesh to carbon, a silence after the initial blast that was more terrible than any sound. The city of 350,000 simply ceased to function. Hospitals were destroyed along with doctors and nurses. Fire stations burned with their equipment. Government offices evaporated with their records. Communication with the outside world was severed for hours. When reports finally reached Tokyo, they described devastation so complete that military leaders initially suspected multiple raids, not understanding that a single weapon could produce such results. President Harry Truman's announcement, broadcast worldwide, that an atomic bomb with the equivalent force of 20,000 tons of TNT had been used, and that Japan faced a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth, seemed like propaganda, too fantastic to be credible. But the evidence was undeniable. American leaflets dropped over other cities warned civilians that their city might be next, listing potential targets, urging evacuation. The psychological impact was profound. If America possessed weapons that could erase entire cities in an instant, what defense was possible? What strategy could prevail against an opponent who could deliver apocalypse by single aircraft? The Supreme Council met in emergency session on August 9th to discuss terms of surrender in response to the Soviet Union's declaration of war on Japan the previous day, a development that shattered any remaining hope that Stalin might mediate a negotiated peace. As the meeting convened at 10:30 in the morning, the second atomic bomb was falling on Nagasaki. News of the attack arrived during the session, transforming debate into crisis. The militarists continued to argue for conditional surrender, but the mathematics had become inescapable. America possessed multiple atomic weapons and the industrial capacity to produce more. America possessed hundreds of B-29s capable of delivering them. America had demonstrated the will to use these weapons without hesitation or remorse. Against such power, deployed by an opponent who showed every indication of continuing until Japan's complete destruction, there was no defense. Japanese cities were built of materials that burned readily. Japanese air defenses had been reduced to handfuls of fighter aircraft and kamikaze pilots, incapable of stopping even conventional raids, useless against atomic attack. Japanese ground forces, however determined, could not shoot down bombers flying at 30,000 feet. The Japanese people, no matter their courage or willingness to sacrifice, could not survive in cities turned to radioactive ash. The deadlock in the Supreme Council was broken by Emperor Hirohito himself in an unprecedented intervention. In the early hours of August 10th, after hours of inconclusive debate, Hirohito spoke what would become known as his sacred decision. Japan would accept the Potsdam Declaration demanding unconditional surrender, with the single condition that the imperial system be preserved. The emperor's voice, rarely heard in policy discussions, carried absolute authority. Those present later described the scene with reverence bordering on awe. The divine sovereign, speaking in the formal, archaic Japanese of the imperial court, acknowledging defeat for the first time in Japan's modern history. His rationale made explicit what many had not wanted to say. The enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable. taking the toll of many innocent lives. Should we continue to fight, it would not only result in an ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation, but also it would lead to the total extinction of human civilization. The atomic bomb had accomplished what 4 years of conventional warfare could not. It had made continued resistance not merely futile but suicidal, not merely costly but genocidal. Hirohito's statement framed surrender not as military defeat, but as an act of preservation, the only way to ensure that something of Japan would survive. Even with the emperor's decision, elements of the military attempted a coup to prevent surrender, seizing the imperial palace on the night of August 14, 15, in a desperate bid to destroy the recordings of Hirohito's surrender announcement and continue the war. The coup failed, suppressed by officers loyal to the emperor and the decision to accept peace. At noon on August 15th, Hirohito's voice was broadcast to the Japanese people for the first time in history via radio, speaking in the same archaic court language that many ordinary Japanese struggled to fully comprehend, but whose meaning was unmistakable. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. The unthinkable had occurred. Across the nation, people listened in silence, many weeping, some in shock, a few in relief. The surrender announcement did not use the word defeat or surrender explicitly, instead speaking of accepting the provisions of the Joint Declaration of the Powers and enduring the unendurable. But everyone understood. The divine empire, the nation that had never known conquest, the people who had been taught that death was preferable to surrender, had bowed to power so overwhelming that resistance had become meaningless. The sound of the B-29's engines, that steady drone that had preceded so much destruction, fell silent over Japanese cities in the days following the surrender. In their place came the sound of American cargo aircraft delivering supplies to prisoner-of-war camps, of American ships entering Tokyo Bay carrying occupation forces, of American jeeps driving through streets that had been prepared for suicidal final resistance, but now stood empty and compliant. The transformation was stunning in its speed and completeness. The military government that had controlled Japan for years simply dissolved. The command structure that had prosecuted the war with fanatical determination now worked with equal determination to ensure orderly surrender. The population that had been exhorted to fight to the death with bamboo spears if necessary, instead lined the roads in silence as American troops marched through cities that had been enemy capitals days before. The explanation for this abrupt shift lay partly in the Japanese cultural reverence for the emperor's authority. When Hirohito commanded surrender, obedience was absolute. But it also lay in a more fundamental recognition that the world had changed in ways that made previous assumptions about warfare obsolete. Japan had gambled that its warrior spirit could overcome material disadvantage, that American democracy was too soft and divided to sustain a long Pacific War, that a negotiated peace would preserve Japan's empire. Every assumption had proven catastrophically wrong. The atomic bomb was the final proof, the ultimate symbol of American power, but it was not the only symbol. American soldiers arriving in Japan carried with them rations that contained more calories than many Japanese civilians saw in a week. American ships unloaded supplies in quantities that seemed impossible to a nation that had suffered through years of shortages and rationing. American technology, radios, vehicles, equipment, demonstrated a level of industrial production that Japan, despite its own industrial base, had never approached. The occupation forces brought not conquest in the traditional sense of looting and revenge, but reconstruction aid, food distribution, and a framework for democratic government. The contrast between what Japanese propaganda had taught people to expect, brutal subjugation, rape, destruction of Japanese culture, and what actually occurred under General Douglas MacArthur's administration created cognitive dissonance that accelerated acceptance of defeat. The Americans seemed genuinely interested in rebuilding Japan, in transforming its government, in creating a peaceful, democratic society. This was not how empires were supposed to behave. It was not how Japan had treated conquered territories. The generosity, even in victory, spoke to reserves of wealth and confidence that Japan had never understood. The atomic bomb's mushroom cloud became the defining image of the war's end, a symbol reproduced in photographs and newsreels, burned into the consciousness of a generation. But the deeper symbolism lay in what the bomb represented: the mobilization of science and industry to a singular purpose, the willingness to invest billions of dollars in a weapon that might not work, the ability to keep such a project secret while employing 130,000 people across multiple states, the strategic vision to recognize that ending the war decisively would save more lives than a prolonged invasion. The Manhattan Project was American power in miniature. Vast resources applied with technical expertise and organizational efficiency toward a clearly defined goal. Japan had possessed brilliant scientists and engineers. Japan had industrial capacity and technical knowledge. What Japan lacked was the combination of scale, resources, and systemic integration that allowed America to pursue multiple parallel paths to victory. Submarine warfare that strangled Japan's economy, carrier task forces that achieved naval supremacy, strategic bombing that destroyed urban centers, and atomic weapons that made resistance literally unthinkable. Each represented a different dimension of American capability, and Japan could counter none of them simultaneously. In the aftermath of surrender, Japanese intellectuals and military leaders struggled to understand how they had so badly miscalculated American resolve and capacity. Some pointed to the vast resources America commanded, a continental nation with 140 million people, untouched by bombing, possessing seemingly limitless oil, steel, and industrial plant. Others focused on American technology and innovation, the ability to develop new weapons and tactics faster than Japan could respond. Still others examined the fundamental difference in how the two nations approached warfare. Japan sought decisive battle, the single engagement that would break enemy will, while America pursued systematic attrition, the grinding accumulation of advantages that made eventual victory mathematically certain. But perhaps the deepest lesson, the one that would reshape Japanese society in the decades following surrender, was that military power alone could not sustain a modern nation, that industrial warfare required industrial capacity beyond anything Japan had possessed, and that the empire Japan had sought to build through conquest was dwarfed by the empire of production and innovation that America had built through economic development. The atomic bomb was not an aberration, but the logical conclusion of this approach. The ultimate industrial weapon, produced by the ultimate industrial power, deployed with the confidence of a nation that knew it could not be matched. On September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri anchored in Tokyo Bay, Japanese officials signed the instrument of surrender in a ceremony heavy with symbolism. The Missouri flew the same flag that Commodore Matthew Perry had flown when he opened Japan to the West in 1853. Reminder that Japan's brief imperial adventure had been bracketed by American power at beginning and end. Overhead, 450 American carrier aircraft flew in formation, a demonstration of the air power that had driven Japan from the skies. General MacArthur, speaking at the ceremony, chose words that acknowledged Japanese courage while making clear the finality of defeat. "It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past." The ceremony lasted 23 minutes. 4 years of war that had killed millions, devastated cities across the Pacific, and ended with weapons that could obliterate humanity itself, concluded with signatures on documents and the formal lowering of flags. The contrast between the years of sacrifice and the brevity of surrender encapsulated the strange arithmetic of modern war. Battles that consumed years resolved by decisions made in moments. Empires that took decades to build dismantled in days. Certainties held for centuries revealed as illusions when confronted with new realities. The mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki dissipated within hours, but their shadows would endure for generations, burned into concrete, recorded in photographs, embedded in the genetic code of survivors. They marked the end of an era when nations could imagine victory through warrior spirit alone, when wars could be fought by conventional means to conventional conclusions, when the gap between winner and loser was measurable in terms of territory gained or casualties inflicted rather than civilizations preserved or extinguished. Japan bowed to American power not merely because that power was greater, though it was overwhelmingly, but because that power was of a fundamentally different character than anything Japan had encountered. It was power born of industrial democracy, of systems that rewarded innovation and efficiency, of an economy that could simultaneously wage total war and improve civilian living standards, of a society that turned citizens into soldiers, and soldiers back into citizens without losing the essential character of either. Japan had sought to build an empire through conquest. America had already built one through production. When the two collided, the outcome was never truly in doubt, only delayed by geography and Japanese courage. The atomic bomb simply made the inevitable undeniable, compressed years of potential fighting into moments of clarity, and forced Japan to confront a truth its military culture had spent decades denying: that in the modern age, the nation that could build most would defeat the nation that could fight best, that abundance was a weapon sharper than any sword, and that freedom, messy, inefficient, seemingly weak, had proven stronger than discipline, sacrifice, and the way of the warrior. The sound of B-29 engines fading from Japanese skies was not merely the sound of peace returning, but the sound of one world ending and another beginning, a world where the measures of power had changed, and where Japan, in defeat, would have to learn the lessons that victory had prevented it from understanding. That true strength lay not in the willingness to die, but in the capacity to build, not in the perfection of martial spirit, but in the productivity of free people, not in the glory of empire, but in the prosperity of peace.